Fighting games seem to be one of the few genres that can justify using almost any type of controller, conventional or otherwise. It took me years to finally find a set of controllers I found comfortable for fighting games, and I'm sure you have your preference, but keep in mind I'm talking about these controllers from the point of view of someone who isn't playing at a high level, as in me. Being a genre born from the arcades, fighting games have traditionally always used the stick and buttons as the main way to control the game. Throughout different regions of the world, you're gonna see different variations on this scheme. The stick might have a bat top, which seems to be more common in Western arcades, versus the ball top, which I've seen mostly in Japanese ones, or even a bullet top, which is like an in-between of these two. The button layouts themselves aren't always the same either. The standard is typically a 6-button layout, which is more common with Capcom fighters. The buttons on top are typically a light, medium, and heavy punch, and the lower 3 being light, medium, and heavy kick. Mortal Kombat will test how far you can spread those fingers and do some freak shit by placing these buttons as far apart as possible in a square shape, in addition to slapping a black button dead center. I don't even know how I should try to place my hand on this. SNK tried to make theirs as comfortable as possible, having them all in a row for each finger to be able to rest on. This style is good for 4-button fighters, but anything more than Capcom's 6-button layout is ideal. For the SNK 4-button layout, I don't like depending on my little pinky to hit harder inputs, so I'm just gonna end up using my index fingers anyways. I've tried for a long time to get comfortable with a stick, and I just can't do it. Honestly, boils down to me having trouble with DP motions and full circle ones. It's hard for me to gauge what motion I'm even doing on a stick, almost like the reactions are lagging behind. A big part of this is certainly as a kid playing exclusively on consoles. Arcades weren't really a thing anymore when I was growing up, so I didn't get exposed to that style so much. I had friends that would play on arcade stick on consoles, but at the time I never saw the need to buy a more expensive controller to use for only one genre. I also had the same opinion on racing wheel controllers. I feel much different about this now, since I won't stop collecting stupid controllers for games I don't even own. I can't dispute the fact though that of all the controllers for fighters, arcade sticks are important to learn. You might be in a situation where setups will only have a stick as an option, as in an arcade machine. Since this has been the standard for so long, this is usually the default people are going to be comfortable with. Arcade sticks also just look the coolest to me. They're so customizable, from the buttons and the joysticks themselves, but also the art. Trust me, I wish I was good on stick. I'd buy a good amount of them just to slap stickers and shit on them. The best feeling one I've ever used was at a demo station for City of the Wolves at EVO. It was a Kwamba stick and felt so great to use, and I could actually get a feel for the DP motions coming out. Having the stick click does give better feedback for motions. With stick, it's also easier for me to use charge type characters than a controller pad for some reason, but those DP and fireball motions take a bit for me to get used to. American sticks mostly used bat tops back in the day, but the Japanese ball top has become more standard worldwide from what I've seen. Shortly after I picked one up, I'm starting to use it a little bit more, but it's not quite my first choice for controllers yet. Sticks seem to be sharing the spotlight with another popular controller, the Hitbox. This is almost the same thing as a stick, minus the stick. Instead, the directional inputs are just buttons. The most common layout for the directional buttons is having left, down, right in a row on top, with the up or jump button below meant for your thumb. This jump button placement alone fucks me up. I can't wrap my head around these buttons being flipped. I know that in most games I can just change these, but the space between them also irks me. So many times I forget to even push this button. I just wish they were a bit closer together. Thankfully, there is a solution, being ones that use arrow keys like what you find on a keyboard. This particular one I love because it actually shows the buttons getting pushed, so it's an instant button check. Also love that it has both orientations for the directional buttons. My major gripe with this one is that the buttons fall off sometimes. This could be easily fixed with some super glue, but perhaps this is a cheaper brand. For hitboxes or hitbox likes, there's a lot of debate on if this controller gives you an advantage that a stick wouldn't. Short answer is yes. Long answer, yes. As much as I'd love to be a part of that discourse, someone who goes over what exactly those advantages are better than I ever could is rubbish. This video is fantastic, and the editing is on another level. I'll link it here and in the description, which I absolutely recommend checking out. Now, someone like me who's not very good needs all the advantages I can get, but the major hurdle is just how weird it feels. Maybe if I played games on a keyboard more, it would be more natural, but after like 30 minutes, my wrists start getting uncomfortable. It's been interesting to watch the FGC adapt more to the hitbox over the traditional stick. At this rate, maybe arcade machines will use the hitbox layout as a standard. I personally would rather have it stay on an arcade stick, but we'll see what happens in a decade's time. There is a pad that caught my attention that was in between a controller pad and an arcade stick made by Arcade. Called the Pad Box, this has an arcade button layout but with a D-pad of a PlayStation controller. The D-pad is even improved since it actually clicks, which gives better feedback of your motions than just using the standard one. My biggest issue with arcade stick and hitbox was just getting used to the movement, since growing up on a controller, using just my thumb has always worked great. Using my whole right hand for a stick, no matter how I hold it, just never felt quite right. When playing a game like Tekken, I ironically had my hands in this position anyways, like I was using arcade buttons. Doing this made it way easier to hit buttons at the same time, or just push them faster in general, but the shoulder buttons were still tricky to reach because of this. With the Pad Box, these extra buttons were all on the face of the controller. Now I just need to get used to holding this. Since this is a bit bigger, it's gonna be unwieldy trying to hold it up, making it best to keep on your lap instead. It isn't made by a huge company, meaning you'll only find this controller on arcade.com if you're interested. I do like this a lot, and it didn't take much for me to eventually get used to the shape. If you want to replace the buttons, that's incredibly easy, but changing the D-pad looks to be challenging, so hopefully I won't need to do that anytime soon. An older controller that maybe the Pad Box was inspired by is the Capcom Pad Soldier by ASCII. This was specifically meant for Street Fighter on the SNES, and it looks super goofy. I assume you're meant to use your index fingers on the buttons opposed to the thumb here. Controllers like these weren't uncommon since early in the genre's life, arcade sticks weren't the standard on the home console versions of fighters yet. There would be controllers trying to make fighters easier to play beyond just using a standard stick, and it wasn't until around the release of the Dreamcast where sticks started to become more the norm outside of the arcade. On paper, this controller is a great idea. The slant of the buttons make it look like it's a little more comfortable to use versus the Pad Box, but sadly it ain't. The button pad seems to be at a slight inward angle that makes this a hassle to use, and it just doesn't feel natural at all. It's much lighter to hold upright, but if you're a hard button pusher, maybe near the lap is better for you. Don't know why I'm giving advice on a controller no one is ever gonna touch. I think this design isn't a bad idea, I just don't think it went through a lot of testing to be comfortable. The Pad Box is great, but what if I'm a coward and I just want to stay in my comfort zone? What controller pad options are viable? Of the three main consoles, the controller options are pretty good now. They mostly improved on what needed tweaking from the previous generations. But in the context of only playing fighters, this might be worse than the previous gen. For the Xbox One controller, the D-pad was finally usable for it simply not being the D-pad dish from the 360. This one clicks when pressing, and you can actually tell what direction you're pushing it. The Xbox Series X, or X-Sex, went back to the single surface D-pad. This one is at least textured and curved to get a better feel, in addition to it clicking. But what was wrong with the old one? That's the main defining difference between the two controllers. This feels like more of an evolution on the 360 controller, not Xbox One. The Switch Pro controller, with some finagling, could be used to work on PC, but this controller is horrible to use in a 2D fighter. With the D-pad, I keep missing inputs, and it just feels too flat and mushed in comparison to the Xboxes. The Pro controller isn't all bad though. For games like Smash and Pokken, the analog stick works perfectly. I used to only use Gamecube controllers for Smash, but I gotta say, the Pro controller might be my new standard. Not only are they easy to find, but they can also be used wirelessly if you prefer. The battery life is also shockingly long. Don't get me started on these Joy-Cons though. Regardless of the orientation, these aren't viable for fighters, and debatably not viable for any game. The D-pad is just 4 separated buttons, which is something the PlayStation controller gives the illusion of, but in actuality, it really is just a singular pad separated by plastic. On the Switch, it really is separate buttons, that way they can be used as the main buttons when flipped on its side. Then you're stuck with one of the worst analog sticks imaginable. This stick is a shorter nub compared to the typical one. Not to mention it's prone to drifting inputs after some use. There's a decent amount of 2D fighters on the Switch, making it a bummer there's not a lot of decent options for a controller. Using a converter like the ones made by Brook might be the only option. The PlayStation has probably my favorite controller overall throughout any generation, PS1 through 3. Sony took a if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach. I think with the PS3 in particular, people were getting sick of the DualShock not getting any improvements like with the back triggers. The PS4 brought a big redesign. The button layout was exactly the same, but it had improved curved back triggers in a more form-fitting shape. My main criticism is with this LED. This light just drains the battery way too fast, and the start button is much too close to these other ones, which can lead to accidental button presses during a match. I still believe this is a great controller, that being said. PlayStation 5's controller decided to mix it up again by making it bigger. I assume this had to be larger because of the improved vibration and haptic feedback on the triggers, but I barely notice those things in any game, so it seems like a wasted gimmick. This comes at a higher price point too, and because of all these added gimmicks, the battery life is criminally short. If the controller felt good to use, then these issues could be forgiven, but I was very disappointed when using this for fighting games. The size is a little off-putting, and the buttons just feel too soft. I don't really mash on a button super hard, but I can feel the wear and tear in this controller faster than most. There's allegedly stick drift on these as well, but thankfully I've never had that issue. For the price of the PS5 controller being $75 USD, I would expect it to be much more durable. The D-pad surprisingly feels flatter than the PS4, and the gloss texture the D-pad has makes it feel like my thumb is slipping off, almost like I'm using a PSP. On the PS5, I prefer just using a brick converter to use my PS4 pads. With the converter, there could be some minimal input lag, but I'll just deal. I've had these for almost a decade, and they still feel just fine. On one positive note, at least the PS5 controller start button is in a much better spot. Now, if only we could get rid of this useless button. The Xbox and PlayStation 5 do have a more premium option. At almost double the price of a standard controller, you can upgrade to the Xbox Elite controller or the PlayStation Edge. With the PlayStation Edge, it's essentially a better quality PS5 controller. The buttons feel a bit flatter to make them quicker to push and feel more durable than the PS5 standard controller, which always seems to degrade in quality much quicker than the PS4. It's odd cause it's not like I'm pushing the button harder than I am on other controllers. Regardless, with the Edge you can shorten the inputs of the back triggers, which is great for faster reactions. There's also the option to add 2 back paddles that can be useful for some folks, but in fighters, even if these are mapped to something useful, I just can't use them since I keep getting thrown off trying to avoid accidentally hitting these. I might just need to get used to it. The D-pad feels the same to me, so no noticeable improvement there. One handy feature is the ability to use these buttons to assign different controller setups. Not sure why there's 2 since they do the same thing, but it's an appreciated feature that helps when playing multiple types of games back to back. I don't think the price is justified though. It's $200 USD, and the quality improvements aren't that noticeable, nor is it that customizable. Looking at the competition from the Xbox, they have the Elite Series controller. This is much more customizable, and you can even go to the Xbox Design Lab and change the color to your heart's content. The D-pad and thumbstick can be swapped out at any time with them all being connected magnetically. It has a rubberized backing on the controller to give you a better grip, and you can also adjust the back triggers to shorten press time. Additionally, there's an option to have 4 paddles on the back. These are just more buttons to worry about, so I just remove them personally. The D-pad can be changed from the Series X plate thing for the Xbox One D-pad. I still prefer the PS5 D-pad, but this is a pretty solid option. The price is much lower at around $150 USD, and I do see these go on sale sometimes, unlike the Edge. The Xbox Elite controller is actually the better bang for your buck. My main gripe with it is that it's an Xbox controller. I just don't like using this controller for fighters. Its placement of the D-pad is uncomfortable, and the buttons stick out much more than the PlayStation controller. This is perfect for shooters, but for fighting games, I don't think it's for me. If you want to go off the grid from first-party options, a third-party equivalent to these more expensive controllers is the Victrix from PDP. This is the most customizable of the premium pad options. You can change the type of D-pad or even remove the right stick altogether to have 6 buttons. It feels like an Xbox controller, and it also has 4 paddles on the back, but it's much more flush. These paddles I have no worries about accidentally hitting. The D-pad, even though it can be changed, is the same as the Xbox One, which is good, but PS5 is still my preference. My main gripe is that with the 6-button layout, the extra 2 buttons are R1 and R2, but the actual right triggers have that same input for R1 and R2, so they both do the same thing. Meaning, if you reassign one of the buttons, you change them both. They probably should have made these extra buttons L3 and R3 instead. That being the case, you can change the buttons further on the Victrix app, so it's not like all is lost. It's just a pain to use a third-party app opposed to on the controller itself. Like, what happens when this app doesn't exist anymore? Are these buttons just trapped to be on whatever stupid setup I put it on? An option I use quite frequently between the standard PS4 controller is the Hori fightpad. This is a controller pad specifically made for fighting games. There's a 6-button layout to be able to easily access more buttons on the face of the controller, and inputs like L3 and R3 are moved to the shoulder buttons, so you have the option to map these and actually use them. The face buttons are intentionally much flatter to allow for quicker inputs and give a little click for feedback using micro switches. The D-pad here is fine, but I wish it was on the level of the pad box. This is better than the Xbox Dish D-pad, but only by a smidge. It's because of this D-pad I go back and forth between this and the standard PS4 one. For Tekken, I'll use the Hori pad, and for Street Fighter, the PS4. Depending on the game I'm playing will determine what needs to be prioritized between the D-pad and the buttons. For Smash Bros, there is certainly no shortage of options on your controller of choice ever since Brawl. The Gamecube controller is a staple of the series. Getting genuine ones can be a bit tough though, and the official adapter is a pain to get now, as it was when it came out. I'm sure that when a new Smash is dropped, another run of the adapters and controller will follow. To fill this void though, third-party companies made their own version of the controller with varying degrees of quality. PDP made one that looks almost identical to the real thing. These get the job done, but they have a cheap kind of feeling about them when you actually hold it. We're not quite at Mad Catz level here, but the buttons almost feel looser. They also added a couple of buttons to make it better reflect modern controllers. We have an additional Z button on the left and select and home buttons now. You can do much worse than this, but it also doesn't really improve on the official controller. Another one that caught my eye was the Nixie Wizard version. This replicates how Joy-Cons work by being able to put these on the Switch screen to have a GameCube controller option when playing portably. I will say it doesn't feel as quality as a GameCube controller. It feels more hollow with cheaper plastic, but overall it's solid. The buttons do feel right and are more flush with the controller. I don't get why the buttons light up since it's wasting battery, but whatever. This also has back triggers too, but are in a spot that kind of feels out of the way. Maybe my hands are just too small. The L and R triggers feel better than the actual GameCubes with these micro switch triggers. The triggers on the standard GameCube controller take way too long to press all the way down, but with these, it's instant. The bigger C-stick is also much needed since it's just a little nub on the original. While playing the most recent entry, Smash Ultimate, I used to only want to use a GameCube controller, but as I got lazy and wanted to not deal with cords over time, I started actually using the Switch Pro controller. This option is really good for Smash, and I like its big meaty buttons more than the GameCube. It's also the ideal controller for fighters on the Switch in general, since the Joy-Con D-pad just doesn't cut it, and the GameCube button orientation for a game like Street Fighter is just too weird. Even if these little things didn't have Joy-Con drift, I just don't like how tiny the buttons are. They give a little click when pushed, but I feel like it's just not enough, and I constantly miss inputs when trying to use these. When Pokken released in arcades, it had a D-pad-centric controller on its setup. There was no option for an arcade stick, and I assumed this was to make people less intimidated to try the game. On the Wii U version playing local versus, one person had to have the Wii U gamepad, and the other the standard Wii U controller. Each person had their own display and a camera angle behind the back of their chosen character. There was no option for a split screen or for each person to use the same Wii U controller. This setup blows, and I remember in tourneys, people had to coin flip for which controller they would get, but both options sucked for different reasons. There actually was an official Pokken controller released for Wii U, and it works for the Switch port as well, and it's almost identical to the arcade machine controller. Now that I've had some time with it, this controller puzzles me. There's only a D-pad on the controller Y. The game switches between 2D fighter and arena fighter, and the D-pad makes the arena fighting feel so unnatural. I don't get why there wasn't an option for both. Honestly, using an analog stick feels better on the 2D fighting phases anyways, since there's not really any complex motion inputs for moves. Sadly, I don't have my one controller fits all, but I did get close with the pad box and the Hori fight pad. PS4 controllers are solid too, but that day is gonna come where it'll be harder to find brand new ones. I know there's folks out there that use freak controllers like the Donkey Kong bongos or the DDR mat or even the Guitar Hero one. These are funny to use, but no one is really gonna use these practically when they wanna win. Of course, with some very rare exceptions, I'm sure. I remember thinking I was gonna use the Dragon Quest Slime controller at EVO to be cute since I knew I was gonna lose. But as I got closer to EVO, I was questioning myself why I even wanted to use this. I decided to actually use the best controller I can to see how I can actually stack up in pools, because I wanted to take this seriously. I think because of that, I was much happier with losing since I knew I did everything I could to win, no excuses that my controller was bad. Everyone has their own preferences when it comes to controllers, and it's such a personalized individual thing that what works for me I'm sure doesn't work for others, and a good button layout in one game doesn't translate to the optimum button layout in another. Thankfully, with modern day games, we do have the ability to customize to an extent, and the options for controllers are more plentiful than ever. Some of you, I have no doubt, have been playing on stick in the arcades and have never touched another controller otherwise, but in this age of having so many different options, that's becoming less and less common as time goes on. But who knows? Maybe someday there'll be a game that I can only actually play with a stick, assuming that they don't become obsolete by the hitbox.